Hey kids, it's Charlie Craven, your friendly neighborhood curmudgeon fly shop owner. And Max and I have been talking, and we are super excited about this upcoming streamer series that we are sort of building and putting together. And it has become a living object that we've got a few different things that we want to cover. And one of the things that we've talked about, all of us have talked about a bunch here in the shop, is, and it's not any secret, I think, around here in the shop, is really our gist of all the stuff that we do is we want to make you better anglers and better fly tyers. It's more interesting for us if you're better at it. You know, that is not. It's not an ego-driven thing. It's not something that, hey, we do this better than these guys or anything like that. We feel like if we are teaching something, then people are getting better at it and enjoy it more. And when you enjoy it more, you do it more, and everybody wins. With that being said, there is so much bullshit in the fly tying world these days that we thought we maybe needed to step in and just sort of reel it in a little bit and talk about what it takes to be a really good fly tyer. And one of the things I've always thought is being a really well-rounded fly tyer. There's a lot of guys that can tie really nice streamers, really nice old-style Catskill dries, or really nice beadhead nymphs. There's not a lot of guys that can tie all of those things very well. And that is one of the criteria that I look at for a good tyer, is somebody that is well-rounded, can tie a lot of different stuff, knows a lot of different techniques. I've always said fly tying is just a collection of techniques, and the more of those tools you put in your toolbox, the better tyer you're going to be at the end of it all. Now, with that being said, we have got, I don't know, what we say, 3-part, 4-part series on streamers that we're putting together, and this is going to be what we're going to call foundation flies. You know, in the last video, what was the last video we just did about trailer flies, tandem streamers? We talked about the old school muddler minnow and woolly bugger. And these are about as old a flies as anybody recognizes these days. I got news for you. These flies are pretty new. You know, 40s, I think is when these came out. I actually wrote down, I think the muddler is 1937, and I think the woolly bugger, maybe I didn't write it down. But at any rate, these are pretty new flies in the world of streamers. And where they all started was long before that. There are so many patterns that came before that these days nobody hears anything about. And that's sort of where the foundation for all these flies that we tie now, you know, everybody thinks of if you come into the shop and ask for a streamer, you're getting a baby ganga or a sex dungeon or something big and bulky like that. Nobody thinks of these old flies these days as streamers. But really, this is where it all came from. And understanding how that worked back then with the limitations of materials and just data, from way back in the day. We're talking the 1880s, 1920s, that kind of time period. Understanding the limitations there and how folks back then built things to imitate little bait fish, and where that has progressed is what we're going to cover in these next several videos. We're pretty excited about it, so hopefully we can shed some light on that, and hopefully you'll have some good questions. If you do, put them in the comments below, and we will try to cover those. I'll actually really will try to cover those. But I want to start with. Let's just see. I've got a whole bunch of notes because I don't want to leave anything out for you. These streamers that we're about to talk about are not. I would not call this beginner stuff. You know, these are founding flies. These are like foundation flies of where you can start to build a skill base. But these are not beginner flies. And you know, so many guys come in and take a fly tying class or just learn to tie online, which is a great way to do it these days. But I'll tell you, man, anybody can tie a goddamn Perdigon. You're not better than anybody else. Nobody is. They're all the same thing. That's not stretching your skill. You're not learning anything new. If you really are into this stuff and you want to get good at it, expand your base, get a little uncomfortable, challenge yourself. And honestly, several years ago, I don't know, it might be 20 years ago now, I got into this little string of doing some of this old stuff. And you know, after tying, you know, literally a million flies my whole life, these flies were challenging. They're interesting. They're something that you haven't done before. And having done this and gone through this little exercise of tying some of this older stuff, I'm a better tyer today because of that. So we're going to start talking about some of these old flies and where they all started from. You know, like I said, we all think of a baby ganga or sex dungeon as a streamer. Back in the day, before there were streamers, back in Scotland, there was Atlantic salmon flies that they used for Atlantic salmon, oddly enough. They were not very good at naming conventions back then, but these big, exotic, fancy beautiful flies. You see them every sticker or lapel pin. If anybody buys you a fly fishing themed gift, it usually has some sort of Atlantic salmon fly on it because it's really pretty. These are essentially big wet flies. And then those kind of got scaled down to smaller size wet flies. And these are feather winged flies. There was not a lot of, there was not really much at all as far as synthetic goes back in the days. So these were feather wing, tinsel, floss, things like that. That sort of expanded into the 19. I think I actually have the wrong set of notes sitting in front of me. So I'm just going to go off the top of my head. I think I left the dates up front. No, the dates aren't that important. Early streamers is what we're talking about. And what started happening is those wet flies started getting a little bigger, is the gist of it. There are featherwing and, I just grabbed those in the wrong order, featherwing and bucktail streamers is sort of where this all got started. That's what was known as a streamer for, all the way through the 50s and into the 60s. These are what streamers were. They still are. And we just, you'll find it funny, we just talked about a Platte River streamer. Little black ghost kind of thing is right along those same lines. A bucktail, there's so many bucktails these days being tied for muskies and big fish flies, but those started as little 2 or 3 inch long little trout streamers. And one of the things that was different about these is that obviously they didn't have the material selection that we have these days. A pretty basic set of mostly natural materials, maybe a few synthetics. Tinsel was pretty off the wall. That was a modern take on it back in the day. Adding streamers or tinsel into flies. A lot of these are. Here's a black-nosed dace, little bucktail streamer. These flies look very simple. They are not simple to tie, and I featured them in my streamer book because they are not simple to tie. And I remember kind of having the conversation with myself, as I often do. It's usually in the shower or when I'm laying in bed at night, about to go to sleep, and whether I wanted to include these flies in the book. And thinking that they were outdated and what could I be teaching from those. And the teaching aspect is what really made those stand out, is nobody really, I shouldn't say nobody, there are guys out there that can do them, but most people can't tie these flies anymore because they don't have that set of skills to get you on this kind of thing. These days, flies get simpler and simpler, and it's, frankly, I think fly tying is getting a little dumbed down. I want you all to be better tiers.
What are some of those sets of skills what are some of the techniques that are lost?
I am glad you asked, Max. Just as a great example, this little hairwing bucktail streamer that I'm holding in my hand, Mickey Finn, same thing goes. If I can hold those up, and you'll have to get pictures of these up close. One of the things, this just looks like some bucktail stacked on a hook. To get the separation of colors is a lot harder than you think it is. This fly is actually pretty even. This fly is not, this has got nice white, black, brown separation on that side. It does not have it on this side. That's why I'm showing you this side. Trying to keep that separation. There's a lot of little techniques, keeping the body perfectly smooth. These flies sort of challenge you on every single step of the way. It's so easy to screw them up. And it's not that they need to be perfect to catch fish, but as an exercise in tying, you want them to be perfect. So you learn to wrap a perfectly smooth thread underbody, a perfectly smooth tinsel body, perfectly spaced oval tinsel rib on any of these. And that, simple things like that transfer to an elk hair caddis that you might tie to go fish on the creek next week. Little detail stuff like that.
Something that really stands out to me, never having tied them, but looking at them, there is nowhere to hide.
There is no, that is 100% true. There is not a big bulky body, a bunch of shaggy stuff sticking out. If there's a lump or a bump, it's going to show. And that's, one, people ask me all the time, like, you tie such pretty neat flies. Why is that? It's because I take pictures of them. When you take a picture of this with a great camera and you blow it up where it's 10 inches long on your screen, you see every flaw. Most of the time you can't see those with your eyeball, but you see them on a photo. This is where you get that attention to details, little stuff like this. The feather wing streamers, the black-nosed dace, gray ghost, can't think of any more off the top of my head anyway. These feather wing streamers, getting that wing set on top of there where it's straight, where those two sets, there's 4 feathers on there. where those feathers cup perfectly. They're exactly the same length. They all line up. That will make you pull your hair out. I used to have a really thick, luscious head of hair until I started doing these, and I had a little practice from tying Platte River Specials, so I was a little better set at it. And if you're a saltwater tyer, matching up those feathers is something that you do on a lot of tarpon flies or saltwater flies as well. But getting that set in that little small amount of space at the head where you've got a nice clean head area, there is no place to hide. Max is right. And this just promotes good tying. And it's a fun challenge. Honestly, you end up with a box fly. Just had this box of wet flies from the wet fly era. From my wet fly era as it is, and you get sort of absorbed in it, and you start to kind of look at little details. And in every case when I'm tying flies, and this is probably why I'm as good a tyer as I am today. In every case of tying every commercial order that I ever did, I was always thinking about what else I could use that technique for, or where I could fine tune. And it's so weird where they come from. The how you space the materials on the hook that might transfer to a size 20 midge later. Like, it's just the skill set is in your head. So you start to build that toolbox, and there's no downside to it. You end up with a box of beautiful flies that are entirely fishable. This old school stuff, I could take this fly out tomorrow. I'd put it on behind something heavy, but I could take this fly out tomorrow, and I guarantee you I could catch fish on it. Any one of these flies sitting on the desk. This old school stuff does work, and I was just talking to Jason about this last night. These old flies are old to you and I. They are not old to the fish. As a matter of fact, these are probably the brand newest flies they've seen this week, because y'all are throwing the same old stuff. So mixing it up a little bit doesn't hurt. I'm going to talk a little bit more just about kind of the progression of how these are fished. Go ahead.
Kim, one more thing about that. We talk about tying better flies, getting people to tie better flies. Those flies are so beautiful, and they are so aesthetically balanced, that I think when you tie stuff like that, I think about with small dainty dry flies, a similar thing. The more you tie pretty, well balanced, aesthetically pleasing flies, the more you want to tie well balanced.
And you recognize stuff that's not. I am the worst critic in the world. The last thing you want to do is sit next to me watching Instagram videos, because I just beat everybody else up, and I'm sorry, I just do it. I have developed an attention to detail over the years that I know I can tell before you do it what that body's going to come out like, because I've made the mistake. It's not that I've never done it. I just have always been better. I've just made that mistake a lot of times before, and that's how you learn to do stuff. You go through and you do it badly, and you do it badly, and it gets a little bit better, and it gets a little bit better, but you have to stick to it long enough to get really very good at it. And I will not say I'm a classic streamer tyer of any stretch. There are guys much better at it that are much more focused on it, but the exercise of doing it will help you be a better tyer all through everything else you tie. Nymphs, dries, all modern stuff as well. I was going to talk about how we fish these. Now, one of the things that you'll notice on all of these kind of old school flies is they tend to have broad, thin profiles. So they're feather wing or bucktail wing. So they've got a wide profile from the side, but they're very thin from the bottom, top, or front or back. There's not much to them. There's just not a lot of bulk like we've built into modern streamers. These flies were typically fished on the swing, not so much of a retrieve. They are all unweighted. Weighting flies came into vogue much later and was sort of controversial. That was everybody badmouths nymph fishing these days. Like back in the day, you didn't even weight your flies. If you fished a fly that sunk, sometimes you lost a few friends. So these flies were meant to be swung. So just on a tight line, you could mend and kind of let it sink a little bit more, but very rarely with any weight. That large profile works really well for a swing, because you're showing the side of the fly to the fish as it crosses through the currents. If you were to strip this fly, that profile is going to, coming away from the fish is going to be much narrower. So that's one of the big differences, and we'll talk about this as we go through these other categories and other videos that we do, how flies have progressed to be a little more imitative, certainly more realistically shaped.
More purpose driven. That was a big
More absolutely purpose driven, just as anything, over the, cars from the 50s aren't the same as cars from these days. But these, are like classic old cars. They're beautiful. There ain't nothing wrong with them. I still think they're the coolest things going. Yeah, that fly, I haven't looked at that fly in a long time. I think I took this off my shelf in my office. They're also multi-layered. You know, when you really get into this, you look at this fly and it looks like a black fly with a little white throat. It's got golden pheasant crest in the middle there. It's got a tinsel body with a gold or a floss body with a gold rib that is pretty darn smooth, if I do say so myself. You know, it's not just whatever materials you have laying around. You kind of have to start to collect some of this stuff.
Do you think there was more of an emphasis on aesthetically pleasing flies in that era?
Yes, for sure. One of the things, kind of going back to the Atlantic salmon fly thing, one of the reasons these flies were so complicated, it was gillies trying to outdo each other, make a more complicated fly, prettier fly. A lot of these feathers were used from the hat trade, the millinery trade. So a lot of these are tied with exotic feathers, you know, jungle cock, swan, you know, golden pheasant, all sorts of different parrot feathers. If you've never read the book, The Feather Thief, that's a great book on this kind of stuff and the lengths that people will go to get this kind of stuff. But that's where that came from, and it definitely, you know, I think the flies of yore were certainly more aesthetically driven and also there weren't nearly as many people fishing. There were probably a lot more fish, a lot more rivers with fish in them. So the fish were probably, I wouldn't even say dumber, just not as educated. You know, so you could get away with that kind of thing. You know, if you went into a creek that had never been fished, I bet you could catch a fish on this fly. I'm sure you could catch an Atlantic salmon on it or steelhead on it. There's lots of stuff these days that's not as complicated, but right along the same lines. They've just been kind of, you know, at risk of sounding rude, dumbed down. You know, just made simpler to tie. But absolutely, part of that was simply to make the fly pretty. But also, you know, as the flies progressed, you know, the white belly, the bucktail on the bottom of that's a two-tone fly. You know, stacking colors. And this all seems so obvious now, you know, in 2025. In 1920, this was a pretty new innovative technique. So these flies were fished a little bit differently than what we would do today. If you took this fly out and just cast it on a floating line and tied it to a piece of OX, it's probably not going to get very deep. I wouldn't say you wouldn't catch fish, but it wouldn't probably be the best way to go about fishing a fly like this. So as flies have progressed, the fishing technique has progressed as well with weighted flies, and we'll get into more of that on more videos as we go forward. I covered the artistic part. Did I cover the artistic part? Have I answered all your questions? We're fishing on the swing, thin profile, and they were tied with the materials of the day, which is one of the things that we just kind of touched on. It's not to say that Joe Bates or Herb Welch or any of those old-timey streamer guys would not have used cactus chenille had they had it available to them. They had to work with what was available. So it's like I say, mostly natural materials, lots of rooster feathers, typically, you know, the butt end of a dry fly feather or a barnyard chicken. You know, there was not way back when, there was no genetic hackle. It was just barnyard chickens. And truth be told, for this kind of stuff, barnyard chickens are way better than anything you could get from a genetic bird these days. These big round tipped feathers are becoming rarer and rarer. When I started doing these, I had lots of old capes from when I was a kid, old Chinese and India capes that are perfect for this kind of stuff. But it's really hard to find modern stuff. Whiting's got the American streamer capes and that kind of stuff with the bigger, rounder tips. But you really do still have to kind of high grade through to find just the right stuff. You know, those old feathers, just on an aside, have a nice thin quill, gives you plenty of room to tie in 4 feathers. Some of these new feathers have a much thicker quill, which makes a tougher fly for a saltwater fly, but is a little bit too wide to get mounted on the front end of that hook with a reasonable sized head. So there's lots of little detail stuff to it, and you could just go down a rabbit hole. You know, I could have been tying these for 20 years. There's just no end to it, and just collecting the materials to it, and that's fun too. You know, there's just that's what makes fly tying so fun. Is you're never good at everything. You know, there's always something and I say that about fly fishing too. There's always something you haven't done. You know, there's Euro nymph, there's regular nymph, there's dry fly fishing, there's double dries, there's streamers. There's, you know, every kind, and all the flies have this same sort of history, nymphs and dries and everything else. You know, seeing what I see on the internet these days, nobody talks about this kind of stuff.
I'm sure there's a ton of killer streamer tires watching this right now with varied catalogs who have never touched a black-nosed dace.
Absolutely. And it's, like I say, if nothing else for the exercise, and that was one of the challenges I issued in my book, is if you think this is an old fly that doesn't matter, is sit down and master it, and then then you can say whatever you want.
Yep.
And it's a good point. You know that I've never wanted anybody to say, "Can you tie this?" And you know, since I was a little kid, I always wanted to be like to be able to say, "Yes, I can." And there's still stuff that I haven't tied, but it doesn't mean I can't. I will figure it out. That's sort of what got me started on all this. But the detail work in flies like that, where there's so little room to hide, there's so much history to it. So you're also sort of, I won't say limited, but bound to the historical aspect of many of them. It's got to be the right material. It's got to be a historically accurate material. For fishing flies, it doesn't probably really have to. But if you're tying, period specific flies, you can get into that little rabbit hole as well.
And in all art, parameters are interesting.
They are, and they can go completely out the window. You could tie modern versions of this, this same pattern with modern materials, and end up with something that's still kind of, it's like the new Bronco versus the old Bronco. It's still recognizable as. That's a great point. Yeah, there are parameters to all of it that are sort of up to you if you stick to them. One of the cool things that they did back in the day that I've always found interesting, and I am just, you guys are so lucky to have me at this age. I am just old enough to know all the stuff. I don't know all the stuff. I know a bunch of stuff from the old days, but I still tie and I still, kind of know all the modern stuff. And one of the things I always noticed when I was a kid is streamer hooks were always really long. These days we tie on 2x long, 3x long, maybe 4x long. Anything longer than that is pretty unusual. This fly is, I think a 9x long Carrie Stevens streamer hook. That was made by Partridge. That is 9 eye lengths, plus. That fly is almost 6 inches long, I'm going to say. Almost 6 inches long. And this is how they made big bait fish back in the day. It wasn't that you had a lot of stuff hanging off the back of the hook. You used the hook for the whole chassis of the fly, and built the fly around the parameter of the hook length. So if you wanted a big fly, you needed a big giant hook. All of the streamer hooks, like I say, were 6x long. I think is what all of them were. This is I cannot remember what hook that is. This Tiemco used to make this hook. It's a beautiful hook. I used it. I used all the ones I had. Then they stopped making them. But this is a sort of modern version of that old streamer hook, and I think this was a 4x long. It's black. It's got a super point on it. Super cool modern hook on an old school fly. So there's some of that kind of cool stuff too. But you can see how big that fly got on one hook. A lot of these flies too, this would be what would be called a New England trolling fly. Guys would tie this on and troll it behind their canoe. It wasn't so much as a casting fly. And interestingly enough, a lot of these old school flies like this were articulated from the 20s or earlier. So 2 of these hooks together to make a big bait fish. So articulation is not new. We didn't invent that. That didn't come in our lifetime. Articulation is not new. It's been around a long time. I don't have any of those flies, or at least not with me. I'm not even really sure what I tied this fly for, but it's super cool.
It's beautifully sparse on the buck tip.
That's one of the coolest things about this is, we think so much of building bulk and volume into a fly without trying to build, mass to it. Yeah. These flies do exactly that. I mean, that's a big fly. It's a big profile. It doesn't have this angle, the top side kind of thing, but super sparse. And that's one of the things that I still try to do on streamers is just build sparsivity is what I call it, which Ross Purnell has told me is not a word. I can't use that in the magazine, but sparsivity. So just doing more with less. But again, that just proves the point. Great exercise in trying to build what you can into a fly without using 10 million materials, and kind of branching out. If you're a thinking fly tyer, you can sit down and look. And I still do it. Sit down and just stare at a fly. I'll take a picture of a fly and just stare at that picture sometimes. You just start to kind of hatch ideas that you can use somewhere else. It may not even be for this fly. It might be for a different fly, but like, I like the way that sits. Maybe I could. And as you start to build this stuff together, these skill sets together, and as I say, we're doing more videos, but you start to take a piece of this fly and you start to add it to a piece of this fly later when you've got both of these mastered. And it might come 2 years later where you're like, what if I put a muddler head on that? That's where we are today. That's 100 years of guys saying, what if? You can't ever say what if you don't know anything about this. That's where the history of it is important. And there's so many good tires these days. There are so many good tires because fly tying is so easy and available to learn. You know, I tied for 3 or 4 years before I saw another person tie a fly when I was a kid. These days, anyone can instantly see very good tires, teach them very specifically how to tie flies. If you don't have somebody to walk you through all this stuff, there are certainly resources for it. There's actually lots of great old books. I'm sure there's internet sites. I'm sure there's YouTube videos of guys tying this kind of stuff. But that is where we've gotten to, is where you start to build this toolbox of, I know how to put this wing on, I know how to put cheeks on, I know how to make a sparse throat. I also know how to make a muddler head. I know how to make it sparse, I know how to make it dense. What if I put these two things together? What if I add a wing from this to the body from that? That's where you start to develop things. And there's, like I said, there's so many good tires out these days, but y'all are limiting yourselves by just doing what everybody else is doing. There's a whole world. There's more than 100 years of this fly tying, of streamer fly tying specifically. That so much of it you just don't even know anything about. Nobody talks about it. Nobody, you know, we see, I don't know, 100 people a day here in the shop.
Talented fly tires.
Very talented fly tires. Very talented fly tires. And every now and again, I'll get somebody asking me about this old school stuff, and which I love. Doesn't mean I want to talk about it all friggin' day, though. Don't come in and stand in my office door. But like, I like this old school stuff because it shows me that you are willing to commit some time and energy to getting better at it and understanding it. And I think that's what makes a really good tire. I think that's one of the things that is sort of lacking these days, is you can tie flies that will go catch the hell out of fish pretty quickly. And if that's all you want to do, more power to you, man. Go do that. If you really want to know a lot about it, if you want to get to be a very good, well-rounded tire, it starts at the very beginning. And it's, like I say, these are not beginning flies. These are not flies that you should tie on day one when you first start tying. This is maybe when you're 3, 4, 5 years into it. And you've sort of built a basic set of skills, or maybe even beyond basic set of skills, then you can start to branch off into the more detailed stuff and the little fine-tuned little pieces and parts that make the difference between really well-tied flies and things that are just sort of hacked together, which we see constantly.
I think it ticks all the boxes. It's sparse, pretty, and effective.
Well, and it's the pretty part of it for me is what
It's the most important.
compels me.
the most
That yes, that you know, the thing is like these.
Right there. I mean, it's just, you want to fish it. Look
The,
at that.
well, and these flies take so, it's not like, you know, honestly, if I sat down and had to do an order of 10 dozen of these, I could bang these out pretty quick.
Yeah.
But I do not want to do that. I want to take as long as I want on each one of these flies, and I want them all to be perfect, just because they are beautiful. You know, I don't care if every one of my mole flies comes out perfect.
That's a
Because
good point. These are as much about process as they are
absolutely, absolutely. As much about learning something, changing details. You know, this is a point that I make in fly tying all the time is, you know, people say, I try to tie that wing in, it comes out crooked every time. Well, if you do the same thing every time and it comes out crooked every time, something needs to be changed. And I make fun of that because I did that for a long time. You know, I tied it in the same way over and over and over again, and it always came out crooked, or the feathers didn't line up right. You've got to change, so you get a chance to sort of try different things, do things a little bit differently. These days you can kind of go on the internet and get a little cheat code to kind of figure out how to do it. But this will build your, I don't know, your figure it out skill. Figure out how you do it. There's, you know, just because everybody else does it one way doesn't necessarily mean that's the way you do it. And that's one of the things I think that I've had the advantage on for a long time, just because I'm just in the right time period. You know, I didn't have I was very interested in it. I didn't have a lot of instruction, so I figured a lot of it out. Since then, a lot of the way I figured out has become kind of the standard way to do it, just because I've been around a long time. It's not that somebody else wouldn't have figured out, they just weren't there at the time. So it's not like I'm smarter, I've just made more mistakes than everybody else and figured out how to get around it. And that comes from tying weird, goofy shit that you wouldn't even consider tying normally. But that's how you get to become a good tyer, which is what we want you to do. So, did I miss anything?
I don't think so.
I don't think I did. I think I covered that pretty well. I didn't talk too fast.
We're gonna do a tying video.
The woolly bugger was invented in 1967. The mother was in 1936. Now that I have this up close to my eyeballs, there's your dates for you guys. What'd you just say?
Black Ghost tying video.
I will do a Black Ghost tying video. I'll probably do a Mickey Finn tying video also. One of those will be in the next week. The other one will be sometime later. like I say, those are both in my streamer book also with tutorials on those. And we've got a couple more videos coming. We're going to do early streamer innovation, which is going to get closer to the Woolly Bugger and Muddler era, which is kind of where everybody thinks everything started. And then we'll cover modern streamer design, which is, you know, so much of what we maybe have already covered, but where that comes from. And watching these in order and us putting these together in order will help all of us with that and kind of see where things progressed and how it went along. I just think that's a better way to understand things. I know I sound like your old college professors, but those fuckers were right too. And I
Somebody
am.
needs to say it.
Somebody needs to say it. Might as well be the old friendly curmudgeon at Charlie's Slybox. You guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. There'll be more. Tune in and catch up with old streamers.